A human boy escorted a disabled alien girl to school. Then the Galactic Queen arrived. The hoverchair jerked sideways and hit the lockers with a loud crack. I heard laughing before I even turned around. 3 boys stood in the middle of the hallway, blocking the path, watching a girl struggle to get her chair moving again. Her hands trembled on the control panel. The chair let out a thin whining sound, like it was hurt too. I did not know her name yet. I only knew she was new, and she was not human. Her skin had a faint blue shimmer under the hallway lights, and 2 small ridges ran along her temples where a human would have eyebrows. Her legs did not move. They rested still against the footplate of the chair, wrapped in a thin silver brace. Craig Dunlop was the loudest of the 3 boys. He leaned against the lockers with his arms crossed, grinning like he had done something clever. "Watch where you're rolling that thing," he said. "This hallway is for people who can actually walk." Nobody stepped in. Kids just kept moving past, eyes down, pretending they hadn't seen anything. That was the part that made my chest tighten. Not the boys. The silence. I walked straight into the middle of it, before I had even decided to. "Move," I said. Craig looked at me like I had said something in a language he didn't understand. "What?" "You're blocking the hallway. Move." For a second, nobody said anything. Then Craig laughed, but it wasn't the same confident laugh from before. It was smaller. He shoved off the lockers and walked away with his 2 friends trailing behind him, muttering something about how I was wasting my time on one of them. I crouched down next to the chair. Up close, I could see the girl's eyes were a deep amber color, almost gold, and they were fixed on the floor like she was trying to disappear into it. "Hey," I said. "You okay?" She looked up at me, surprised, like she hadn't expected anyone to ask that question, and actually wait for an answer. "I am functional," she said. Her voice had a strange, musical edge to it, like 2 notes played at once. "The chair's stabilizer is damaged. It happens when it is struck." "I can fix that," I said. "I fix bikes all the time. Chairs can't be that different." She blinked at me. "You would help me." It wasn't really a question, but it sounded like one. Like she was testing the sentence, seeing if it was true before she believed it. "Yeah," I said. "Obviously. My name is Ethan Brooks. I was 16 years old, and until that morning, my biggest problem in life had been a math test I forgot to study for. I want to be honest about that, because everything that came after started with something small, a broken chair. A hallway, a decision that took less than 5 seconds to make and changed the rest of my life. Her name, she told me, was Vex Lyra. She said it slowly, syllable by syllable, so I could get it right. I asked if there was a shorter version, and she hesitated, like the question surprised her again. "Some call me Vex," she said, "but only those who are comfortable with me." "Vex it is then," I said, and something in her expression shifted. It wasn't quite a smile. Her species didn't smile the way humans did, but her eyes softened, and the tension in her shoulders eased just slightly. I got the chair working again in about 10 minutes, kneeling on the hallway floor, while other students stepped around us like we were furniture. The stabilizer had a cracked housing, and I taped it together with what I had in my backpack, enough to hold until she could get it properly repaired. When I stood up and offered to walk her to her next class, she looked at me for a long moment before answering. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know," I said. "I want to." She didn't argue after that. We walked together down the hallway, me on foot, her chair gliding quietly beside me, and I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. Every other alien student in the building, and there were a handful scattered through different grades, seemed to go out of their way to avoid her. Not with cruelty, not like Craig and his friends, just with distance. A step to the side, a turned shoulder, a conversation that suddenly needed to happen somewhere else. I didn't understand it yet, but I filed it away. Something about the way they avoided her felt deliberate, like there was an unspoken rule everyone else already knew, and I was the only one who hadn't been told. Our school had started accepting alien exchange students 2 years earlier, part of some program the government set up after first contact happened when I was in middle school. Most of them stuck together, ate lunch together, studied together. It made sense. New planet, new customs, safety in numbers. But Vex Lyra sat alone every day at the far end of the cafeteria, near the recycling bins, where nobody had to look at her if they didn't want to. I found out later that this wasn't an accident, it was intentional. She had chosen that seat herself. That first week, I walked her to class every single day. It wasn't some grand decision I made all at once. It just kept happening. I'd see her chair at the end of the hallway in the morning, and my feet would just start moving toward her before my brain caught up. We didn't talk about deep things, not at first. She asked me questions about human school, about sports, about why we ate lunch at such a specific time, instead of whenever we felt hungry. I asked her about her home planet, though she answered those questions carefully, like she was choosing her words from a very short list of safe ones. "Your legs," I asked her on the fourth day, as gently as I could manage. "Were you born like that, or did something happen?" She was quiet for a moment. The chair hummed softly as it moved. "I was born like this," she said finally. "It is called a stillborn limb condition. Rare, but it happens. Among my people, it is considered," she paused, searching for the right word, "a failure. Not mine, my blood's." "That's ridiculous," I said, before I could stop myself. She looked at me sharply, and for a second, I worried I had offended her. But instead, something flickered behind her eyes, something that looked almost like relief. "Yes," she said quietly, "it is." I wanted to ask more, but she changed the subject, and I let her. I had a feeling I was standing at the edge of something much bigger than a broken chair and a hallway, something she wasn't ready to hand me all at once. So I didn't push, I just kept showing up. By the second week, I noticed she started waiting for me by the front doors, instead of near her locker, which was farther away. It took me a few days to realize she was doing it on purpose, positioning herself somewhere I couldn't miss her. It made something warm settle in my chest, though I didn't examine that feeling too closely at the time. I was 16. I didn't examine much of anything too closely. One morning, it was raining hard, the kind of rain that turns the parking lot into a shallow lake. I got to school early, and found her stuck at the bottom of the ramp near the side entrance, the wheels of her chair spinning uselessly against a puddle that had pooled where the concrete had cracked and sunk. The school had built the ramp years ago, technically meeting the legal requirement, but nobody had maintained it since. It sloped wrong. Water collected at the bottom every time it rained. I had walked past that ramp 100 times without ever noticing it was broken, because it had never needed to hold my weight, my safety, my ability to get through the front door. "This happens every time it rains," she said, and her voice had none of the careful calm from our other conversations. It sounded tired, worn down. I called the front office. They said they would fix it next semester. I looked at the cracked concrete, the shallow lake of rainwater, and something hardened in me that hadn't been there before. "Next semester isn't good enough," I said. I pushed her chair through the puddle myself that day, my shoes soaked through by the time we reached the door, and I went straight to the front office during my free period. The secretary told me the same thing Vexlira had already heard. Budget constraints, next semester. I asked for the maintenance supervisor's name and got it, then found him during lunch, in the small workshop behind the gym, and asked him directly why a ramp that was supposed to help people, instead, nearly stranded a student in the rain. He looked surprised that a student had come to ask him personally. Most complaints, he said, went through paperwork that sat on someone's desk for months. I told him I would come back every single day until it was fixed, and I meant it. 3 days later, there was fresh concrete poured at the base of the ramp, sloped correctly, with a small drain cut into the side to keep water from pooling. When I showed Vexlira the finished ramp, she rolled over it slowly, testing it, then stopped at the top and looked back at me. "You did this," she said. "I just asked someone to do their job," I said, feeling suddenly awkward under the weight of her stare. "No," she said. "Nobody else asked. Not even me, not really." I asked politely and accepted the answer I was given. "You did not accept it." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just shrugged and said something about how it wasn't a big deal, even though something in my chest told me it actually was. It was the first time I saw her look at me like I was something more than a stranger who happened to be kind to her once. Like I had become, in some small and unspoken way, someone she trusted. I had no idea, standing there in the wet morning air, with rain still dripping off the gym roof, that the ramp I fixed, and the friendship I was building, without even trying, would one day matter to more than just the two of us. I had no idea that somewhere far above the clouds, in a place none of us could see, something was already watching, recording, waiting. I only knew that Vexlira smiled at me that morning, in her own quiet alien way, and that it felt like the best thing that had happened to me in a very long time. I walked her to class like I always did, and neither of us said much else. But something had shifted between us. A door had opened, even if neither of us knew yet how large the room behind it really was. The fixed ramp became a kind of turning point, though I did not realize it right away. Small things started changing after that morning. Vexlira began talking more, laughing more, if you could call the soft, two-toned hum she made when something amused her a laugh. I started to understand her better, the way her ridges lifted slightly when she was curious, the way her hands would still completely when she was nervous, like she was trying not to draw attention to herself. We fell into a routine. I met her at the front doors every morning, walked her through the halls, sat with her at lunch even though it meant giving up my usual table with Noah Bailey and the rest of my friends. Noah teased me about it at first, the way friends do, but he stopped once he actually met her. She had a dry sense of humor that caught people off guard, the kind that snuck up on you a full 10 seconds after she said something, and by the second week, Noah was pulling up a chair at our new lunch table without me even asking. "You know," Noah said one afternoon, watching Vexlira solve a physics problem on my notebook faster than either of us could follow. "She's kind of terrifying when she wants to be." "She's not terrifying," I said. "She's smart." "Same thing, depending on who you ask," Noah said, and Vexlira made that two-toned sound again, the one I had started to recognize as her laugh. It felt normal. That was the strange part. Looking back, it felt like an ordinary friendship, built out of ordinary days, math homework and cafeteria food, and walks down hallways that smelled like floor cleaner. I did not think of what I was doing as brave or important. I thought of it as just being her friend. But the other alien students still avoided her. That part never changed, no matter how much lighter Vexlira seemed around me and Noah. I noticed it more now that I was paying attention. There were about a dozen Ithari students scattered across the school, easy to recognize by the faint shimmer of their skin and the twin ridges along their temples. They moved through the halls in loose groups, always together, always polite to teachers and other students. But whenever Vexlira's chair came near them, they shifted. A conversation would end early. A group would turn down a different hallway. Once, I watched a girl about our age, an Ithari student named Sael, actually change direction mid-step to avoid walking past us, her eyes fixed firmly on the floor the entire time. "Why do they do that?" I finally asked Vexlira one day as we sat outside during a free period, the afternoon sun warm against the brick wall behind us. She was quiet for a long moment, turning something over in her mind before she answered. "Among my people, there is a word," she said slowly. "It does not translate perfectly into your language. The closest meaning is unfinished. It is used for those born with conditions like mine, a body that did not complete its intended shape." "That's an awful way to describe a person," I said. "It is not meant as cruelty," she said, though her voice had gone quiet and careful. "It is meant as fact, to my people. A statement, not an insult. Ithari society values completeness above almost everything else. Strength, symmetry, function. Those born unfinished are not punished exactly. They are simply set aside, given smaller roles, kept at a distance, so as not to remind others of what could go wrong." I felt something twist uncomfortably in my stomach. "That's still awful," I said. "No offense." "None taken," she said, and there was the faintest trace of something that might have been gratitude in her voice. "I have thought the same thing many times, though I was taught not to say it aloud." I asked her, carefully, why she had been sent to Earth in the first place, so far from her homeworld and her own people. She hesitated, and I watched her weigh the question, deciding how much of the truth to give me. "My family arranged it," she said finally, "but it was explained to me as an opportunity, a chance to study among a species still new to the wider galaxy, to learn things that might be useful later. I did not question it deeply at the time. I only knew I wanted to leave. Here, at least, no one already knew what I was supposed to be. I did not press further, though something about the way she said it stayed with me, a small unanswered question, sitting quietly at the back of my mind. I had no way of knowing yet how much larger the truth actually was, How carefully that explanation had been built to hide something far more complicated. To me, in that moment, she was simply my friend, sitting beside me in the sun, telling me a small piece of a story she had clearly been taught to keep small. Over the following weeks, our friendship deepened in ways that felt easy and natural. She taught me a simple form of Ithari sign language, called can't, meant for moments when speaking put too much strain on her throat, which happened more often than she liked to admit. Her vocal cords, she explained, were not built for extended human speech patterns, and by the end of a long day of talking, her throat would ache in a way that reminded her, again and again, of being different. I picked up the signs quickly, mostly because I wanted an excuse to keep talking to her, even when her voice grew tired. We developed our own shorthand, a mix of her signs and gestures I made up myself, until we could hold entire conversations across a crowded classroom without saying a word out loud. Teachers found it strange, students found it stranger, but neither of us cared. In exchange, I taught her to shoot a basketball from her chair during gym class, something the school had never bothered to adapt for her. The gym teacher, a tired man named Mr. Doyle who mostly wanted to get through each period without incident, gave us permission to use the side court while the rest of the class ran drills. Vexlira was terrible at it at first, the ball bouncing off the rim at strange angles, her aim thrown off by the different balance of shooting from a seated position. But she refused to give up, taking shot after shot with a stubbornness that reminded me, more than once, of myself. By the third week, she made her first basket clean, the ball dropping through the net with a soft snap of the chains, and the sound she made was unlike anything I had heard from her before. Loud, unrestrained, a full, bright laugh that had nothing careful about it at all. A few kids from the other side of the gym turned to look, surprised, and for once, she did not flinch away from the attention. She just kept smiling, watching the ball roll toward the wall, like she had won something far bigger than a single shot. I did not think I could do that, she said, still catching her breath. You just needed practice, I said. Anyone can learn anything, if they keep trying. That is a very human thing to believe, she said, but she said it warmly, like it was a compliment rather than a criticism. Not everything was easy, though. Craig Dunlop had not forgotten the hallway confrontation from our first week, and he found small ways to make his resentment known. Nothing large enough to get him in real trouble, just enough to be exhausting. A shoulder that bumped her chair too hard while walking past. A comment muttered just loud enough to be heard. Once, he and his friends rearranged the desks in our shared history class, so there was no space left at the end of the row for her chair to fit, forcing her to sit awkwardly in the aisle until the teacher noticed and fixed it. I confronted him about it more than once, and each time he backed down, but the small cruelties kept finding new shapes. Vexlira told me not to let it bother me, that she had faced far worse among her own people, but I could see it wearing on her in quiet ways. A stiffness in her shoulders, a longer pause before she spoke. I started walking a half step closer to her chair after that, close enough that anyone looking to bump into it would have to go through me first. She noticed, of course, she noticed everything. You do not need to guard me, she said one afternoon, not unkindly, just observing. I'm not guarding you, I said. I'm just walking next to my friend. She looked at me for a long moment, and something behind her amber eyes softened in a way I had come to recognize as her version of deep feeling, the kind her people apparently were not supposed to show openly. You say that so easily, she said quietly. Friend. Because it's true, I said. She did not answer right away, but she reached over, and, in a small gesture I had come to understand meant a great deal in Ithari custom, pressed 2 fingers briefly against the back of my hand. It was the closest thing to a hug her culture allowed between people who were not family, she had once explained to me. I did not know that then, not fully, but I understood the weight of the gesture anyway, and I let my hand stay still until she pulled hers away. What neither of us knew, in that quiet, ordinary moment on an ordinary afternoon, was that we were not as unnoticed as we believed. Somewhere above the clouds, far beyond anything human instruments could detect, a small, silent vessel had been holding position for weeks, cataloging every hallway conversation, every basketball shot, every quiet gesture of 2 fingers against skin. The reports it sent were not addressed to any human authority. They were addressed to someone far more powerful, someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence before deciding what to do next. I had no idea, walking Vexlira to her next class that afternoon, that the peaceful little world we had built together, in the halls of an ordinary school, was about to attract an attention far greater than either of us could imagine. I only knew that she was smiling, that her chair moved a little lighter down the hallway, and that for the first time since I had met her, she did not glance toward the Athari students clustered by the far lockers to check whether they were watching. She had stopped caring whether they saw her happy. I should have realized that was exactly the kind of thing someone, somewhere, would notice. The sky tore open just after 9 in the morning, right in the middle of second period. I remember the exact sound, because I had never heard anything like it before. A low-pressure wave rolled through the building first, rattling windows in their frames, followed by a deep rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the sky itself had cracked down the middle. Mrs. Patel stopped mid-sentence at the whiteboard, chalk still raised in her hand, and every student in the room turned toward the windows at the same time. Outside, the clouds were splitting apart in a straight, unnatural line, peeling back like curtains being pulled open by something enormous. Through the gap, I could see the dark shapes of ships descending, not the small transport vessels we had grown used to seeing over the past 2 years, but something far larger, sleek and silver, moving with a silence that felt wrong given their size. There were at least a dozen of them, arranged in a formation too precise to be anything but military, escorting something even bigger at the center, that I could not fully make sense of through the glass. The school intercom crackled to life almost immediately, the principal's voice tight, with a calm that did not match the tension underneath it. Students were instructed to remain in their classrooms. Teachers were instructed to lock their doors. Nobody, the voice repeated twice, was to go outside under any circumstances. I sat frozen at my desk, my mind racing through every possibility, none of which made sense. First contact had been peaceful. The exchange program had been peaceful. Nothing in the 2 years since aliens had become a normal part of our lives had prepared me for warships splitting open the sky above a high school in the middle of a Tuesday morning. Then I thought of Vexlira, 3 classrooms down the hall, and my stomach dropped. I did not think it through. I did not weigh the risk the way I probably should have. I simply stood up, ignored Mrs. Patel calling my name behind me, and walked straight out of the classroom and into the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. The hallway was chaos, teachers trying to herd students back into rooms, the intercom repeating its instructions on a loop, the low hum of the ships outside now audible even through the thick school walls. I pushed through the crowd toward Vexlira's classroom, and when I got there, I found her already in the doorway. Her chair stopped halfway across the threshold, her eyes wide and fixed on the windows at the end of the hall. "Vex," I said, reaching her side. "What is that?" "Do you know what that is?" She did not answer right away. Her hands were gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles had gone pale, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out barely above a whisper, shaking in a way I had never heard from her before. "That is the Royal Fleet," she said. "That is my mother." I did not understand the full weight of those words yet, but the fear in her voice told me everything I needed to know. Whatever was happening, it was not a rescue, and it was not good news. "Your mother," I repeated. "Vex, what does that mean? Why would your mother bring warships to a high school?" "Because I lied to you," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. "Not about who I am, about why I am here. Ethan, I need you to understand. I did not choose to hide this from you to hurt you. I chose it because I did not think it would ever matter." Before I could ask anything else, the front doors of the school blew inward, not with violence, but with a controlled precision that was somehow more frightening, hinges groaning as unseen force pushed them open from the outside. Bright light spilled into the main hallway, and figures began to walk through it, tall and armored, moving with the kind of discipline that only came from years of trained formation. Students screamed and scattered into classrooms. Teachers shouted instructions that nobody was listening to anymore. At the center of the approaching group walked a figure who needed no introduction, though I had never seen anyone like her before in my life. She was tall, taller than any human I had ever stood near, with skin that held the same faint blue shimmer as Vexlira's, but deeper, richer, catching the hallway light like polished stone. Her robes were dark and layered, trimmed with a metal that seemed to shift color depending on the angle you looked at it, and a crown of interlocking silver bands sat across her brow, not gaudy or oversized, but unmistakably a symbol of absolute authority. Her eyes, the same deep amber as her daughter's, swept across the hallway with an intensity that made every student still in sight go completely silent. 2 armored guards flanked her on either side, weapons held at rest but clearly ready, and behind her walked a smaller figure in formal robes, carrying a thin datapad that he consulted with quick, nervous glances. The Queen's gaze found Vexlira almost instantly, cutting through the crowded hallway like she had known exactly where to look before she even arrived. "Vexlira," she said, and her voice carried through the hallway without needing to be raised, deep and resonant, filling the space in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You have been difficult to locate, Mother," Vexlira said, and I watched her spine straighten, watched years of careful training snap into place in an instant, the easy warmth I had grown used to disappearing behind a mask of formal composure. "I was told this location was to remain confidential." "Circumstances have changed," the Queen said. Her eyes moved briefly to me, standing beside her daughter's chair, and something in her expression shifted, though I could not read what it meant. "I see you have not been alone." "This is Ethan," Vexlira said quickly, though I could hear the effort it took to keep her voice steady. "He is a friend from school. He has no bearing on this matter." "Does he not?" the Queen said, and the way she said it made my skin prickle. It was not a question. It sounded like she already knew the answer, and was simply testing whether her daughter would tell the truth. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on us, students peering out from cracked classroom doors, teachers frozen in the hallway, all of them watching this exchange unfold, without understanding a word of the tension underneath it. I understood even less than they did, but I understood enough to know that whatever was about to happen was going to change everything. "Your Majesty," the man with the datapad said quietly, stepping forward with a small bow. "The survey team's reports are prepared." "Shall I proceed with summarizing the findings for the record?" The Queen did not look away from her daughter. "Proceed." He cleared his throat and began reading from his datapad, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone used to delivering information without allowing his own opinion to color it. He spoke of weeks of surveillance, of a small observation craft stationed in high orbit, of daily logs cataloging the movements and interactions of the subject designated Vexlira. He described, in flat clinical language, a broken hoverchair repaired in a school hallway, a cracked ramp rebuilt within days, after weeks of official inaction, repeated defense of the subject against hostile peers, regular physical proximity maintained by choice, not obligation, a pattern of behavior the report described, almost clumsily, as sustained voluntary care, absent any apparent incentive. I realized, listening to him read, that every quiet moment I thought had belonged only to the two of us had actually been recorded. Every hallway walk, every lunch conversation, every clumsy basketball shot. Someone somewhere above the clouds had been watching all of it, turning it into evidence for a case I did not even know was being built. "That is enough," the Queen said, cutting him off mid-sentence. He fell silent immediately, stepping back with another small bow. The Queen studied her daughter for a long, heavy moment, and then, for the first time, she looked directly at me, her amber eyes searching my face with an intensity that made it very difficult to hold still. "You are the one who repaired the ramp," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I expected, though my heart was still pounding. The school kept putting it off. It wasn't fair to make her wait. And the chair, and the confrontations with hostile students, and the hours spent teaching her a sport her body was never designed for. "She's my friend," I said. "That's not a strange thing where I'm from. You help your friends." Something flickered across the Queen's face, too brief for me to name, and she turned back to Vexlira before I could try to understand it. "You were sent here," the Queen said, and her voice had grown quieter, though somehow it felt heavier for it, under the explanation of academic opportunity. "You understand, I think, that this was never the true reason." Vexlira's hands tightened on the armrests of her chair again. "I suspected," she said carefully. "I was not certain." "Then let me remove all uncertainty," the Queen said, and she turned to address the man with the datapad, without ever raising her volume, her words falling into the silent hallway, like stones dropped into still water. Prepare the rite. We will conduct it here, as planned, before I depart. Mother, Vexlira said, and for the first time since the Queen had arrived, real fear broke through the careful composure she had been holding on to. Please, not here. Not like this. It is precisely because it is here that it must be done now, the Queen said, and something in her tone made it clear the decision had already been made long before she ever stepped off her ship. You were sent to this world specifically because it was distant, unremarkable, and unlikely to draw attention to a matter our people would prefer remain quiet. I intended for the rite to be completed in privacy, far from anyone who might carry word of it back to court. That privacy no longer serves its purpose, given what my observers have documented. I would rather finish this myself, in full understanding of the circumstances, than allow rumor and half-truth to shape the story instead. I did not understand what a rite meant in this context, not fully, but the color had drained from Vexlira's face, and her hands had begun to tremble against the armrests of her chair, in a way that told me everything I needed to know. Whatever was coming, it was not a small thing. It was not a formality. It was something she had clearly been dreading for a very long time, something she had hoped, perhaps, might never actually happen if she simply stayed far enough away, hidden well enough, for long enough. What right? I asked, stepping slightly in front of her chair without fully deciding to do it. What is she talking about? The Queen's eyes moved back to me, and for the first time, I saw something in her expression that looked almost like curiosity, as though I were a variable in an equation she had not accounted for. You truly do not know, she said. No, I said. Nobody's explained anything. All I know is my friend is scared, and you're the reason. A murmur rippled through the guards flanking the Queen, though she raised one hand slightly, and it silenced instantly. She studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before she spoke again, and when she did, her voice had lost none of its authority, but something underneath it had shifted, subtle and cold. Among my people, she said, a body that fails to form completely is considered a mark against the bloodline that produced it. It is not punished with cruelty. It is corrected, quietly, through a formal rite that removes the individual from succession, from title, from any position of consequence within their family's standing. It is not meant as an act of hatred, boy. It is meant as an act of order, a restoration of what was meant to be. She's not broken, I said, and I felt my voice shake, not from fear this time, but from something closer to anger. There's nothing about her that needs correcting. That is not your judgment to make, the Queen said, though there was something in the way she said it that sounded less certain than her words suggested, as though she were repeating a line she had said many times before, and was, for the first time, hearing how it actually sounded out loud. Behind me, I heard the shuffle of footsteps, and I turned to see Noah pushing his way through the crowd of students, still watching from doorways, his face pale, but his jaw set with determination. He came to stand beside me without a word, close enough that his shoulder brushed mine. Whatever's happening, he said quietly, just to me. I'm not leaving either. More footsteps followed, students I recognized from our lunch table, from gym class, even a few I barely knew, drifting slowly out of their classrooms, despite the earlier warnings over the intercom, forming a loose but unmistakable line between the Queen's guards and Vexlira's chair. Teachers stood frozen at the edges, unsure whether to stop them, and I could see Mrs. Patel watching from her doorway with an expression I could not quite name, something between worry and quiet pride. The Queen looked at the growing crowd of human teenagers slowly gathering in front of her daughter, none of them armed, none of them trained, none of them with any real understanding of what they were standing against, and something in her posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, as though the ground beneath her certainty had begun, just slightly, to move. This is not your affair, she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier iron. She's our friend, I said. That makes it our affair. The Queen's eyes moved slowly across the line of students, taking in each face, each stubborn, frightened, determined expression, and then settled back on her daughter, sitting in her chair at the center of it all, no longer looking down at the floor the way she had in that very first hallway weeks ago, but sitting straight, chin lifted, watching her mother with an expression that was, for the first time since the Queen's arrival, not entirely afraid. You have built something here, the Queen said quietly, almost to herself. Something I did not anticipate. Nobody answered her. The hallway held its breath, waiting to see what she would do next, and I stood at the front of that line, with my heart pounding, and no idea whether I had just made things better, or made them very, very much worse. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Nobody moved. The Queen stood at the head of her guards, studying the line of students in front of her, and I stood at the front of that line with my legs shaking even though my voice had stayed steady. Then the man with the datapad cleared his throat again, breaking the silence with obvious reluctance. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the rite requires a location of formal standing. Perhaps the courtyard would serve better than a hallway." The Queen did not look away from me when she answered. "The hallway will serve exactly as well as the courtyard," she said. "Move outside if it eases the ceremony, but understand this will proceed regardless of location." I felt Vexlira's hand find mine at my side, gripping it tightly, and I realized her fingers were trembling. I squeezed back without thinking, and for the first time since the Queen's arrival, I saw her take a full breath, like she had been holding it since the ships tore through the clouds that morning. We moved outside because the guards insisted on it, the whole procession spilling out through the main doors into the courtyard, where students usually ate lunch on warm days. The morning sun felt strange against my skin after the tension of the hallway, too bright, too ordinary for what was happening. The Queen's remaining guards had formed a loose perimeter around the school, and I could see more students pressed against windows on every floor, watching in silence. The Queen stood at the center of the courtyard, and the man with the datapad produced a small case from beneath his robes, opening it to reveal a thin metal disc, etched with symbols I did not recognize. My stomach turned over just looking at it. "Before this begins," I said, stepping forward again, even though every instinct told me to stay quiet and let this happen the way people much older and much more powerful than me had apparently already decided it would. "I want to say something." The Queen turned to face me fully, her expression unreadable, though I noticed the guards on either side of her tense slightly, hands shifting closer to the weapons at their sides. "You are persistent," she said. "I will allow you this, briefly, before we proceed." I looked back at Vexlira, sitting in her chair at the edge of the courtyard, her amber eyes wide and fixed on me, and I felt every ounce of fear I had been carrying since the ships appeared settle into something steadier, something that felt less like panic and more like conviction. "You keep calling her unfinished," I said, turning back to the Queen, like her legs not working means something is missing from her. "But I've watched her outthink every person in our physics class without trying. I've watched her make basketball shots that took me years to learn, because she refused to stop practicing even when it hurt. I've watched her comfort kids in our class who were having a bad day, kids who barely knew her, just because she noticed they needed it. None of that sounds unfinished to me. It sounds like exactly the opposite." "You speak from ignorance of our customs," the Queen said, though her voice had lost the sharp certainty it carried back in the hallway. "Maybe," I said, "but where I'm from, we don't measure a person by whether their body works a certain way. We build ramps. We build chairs that move on their own. We build classrooms that fit everyone, not because we feel sorry for anyone, but because we understand that what a person can do with their mind and their heart has nothing to do with whether their legs move. My grandfather lost the use of his hand in an accident before I was born. Nobody in my family ever once called him unfinished. We just figured out how to make the world work for him instead of expecting him to disappear into a corner because he didn't fit some old idea of what a person should look like." A murmur rippled through the small crowd of students still gathered by the doors, and I saw Noah nod firmly beside me, arms crossed, refusing to back down, even though I could tell he had no idea what to expect next. The Queen's gaze drifted, almost involuntarily, toward Vexlira, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. Her expression caught somewhere between old certainty and something newer, something that looked almost like doubt. "It is not so simple," the Queen said finally, though her voice had grown quieter. "Our laws are old. They were built to preserve strength across generations, to ensure our people remained capable in a galaxy that has not always been kind to weakness." "With respect," I said, "I don't think you actually believe that's what she is. I think you're scared of what it means if she isn't." The words left my mouth before I fully understood how bold they were, and I watched the Queen's expression shift into something sharper, colder, and for a moment I thought I had gone too far, that I had crossed a line no 16-year-old human boy had any right to cross in front of a woman who commanded warships capable of splitting the sky. But then, slowly, the Queen turned her head, and instead of looking at me, she looked at her daughter. Vex'lyra had not moved from her spot near the doors, but something about her posture had changed entirely since the Queen's arrival that morning. She was not shrinking anymore. She sat with her spine straight, her chin lifted, her amber eyes steady and unflinching, meeting her mother's gaze, directly for what looked like the first time in a very long time. Behind her, a dozen human students stood in a loose but determined line, none of them running, none of them looking away, all of them simply standing there, because they had decided, without any instruction from anyone, that this mattered enough to stand for. "You are not afraid," the Queen said quietly, and it was not clear whether she was speaking to Vex'lyra or simply thinking aloud. "I am afraid," Vex'lyra said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, despite the visible effort it cost her. "I have been afraid of this moment since I was old enough to understand what it meant, but I am not ashamed, Mother. Not anymore. Not here." "Explain," the Queen said. Vex'lyra glanced at me briefly, before continuing, and something about that small glance gave her the last bit of courage she needed. "For weeks," she said, "I have lived among people who never once asked what was wrong with my legs, before deciding whether I was worth their time. They fixed a broken ramp because it was the right thing to do, not because I demanded it. They stood between me and cruelty without being asked. They taught me things and learned things from me in return, as equals, not as a burden being tolerated out of pity. I did not have to hide what I am here. I did not have to earn the right to simply exist as myself." Her voice caught, and she took a moment before continuing, her hands steady now on the armrests of her chair, in a way they had not been since the ships first appeared. "You came here believing you would find shame," she said. "Instead, you found this. I am not going to apologize for it." The courtyard fell silent again, the only sound the faint hum of the ships still hovering somewhere above the tree line, and the Queen stood perfectly still, studying her daughter with an expression I could not read at all. The man with the datapad shifted nervously, still holding the small metal disc, clearly uncertain whether he was meant to proceed or wait for further instruction. Finally, the Queen spoke, and her voice, when it came, sounded different than it had at any point since she arrived. Quieter, less certain of the ground beneath her own feet. "I watched the reports for weeks before I ever set foot on this world," she said slowly, as though working through the thought as she said it aloud. "I saw the ramp repaired. I saw the games played. I saw a hallway of strangers refuse to move aside from you today, not because they were commanded to, but because they chose it freely. I told myself these were curiosities, isolated behaviors, unlikely to mean anything of substance." She paused, and for the first time, her eyes moved from her daughter to the wider crowd of human students still standing firm by the doors. "I did not expect to find an entire pattern of belief, a civilization that has apparently decided, collectively, that a body's shape says nothing about a person's worth." "It's not perfect," I said quietly. "We still get it wrong sometimes. There are people back home who think the same things your laws say, but we're trying to get better at it, and when we see it done right, in front of us, most of us know enough to recognize it." The Queen looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression had softened into something I had not expected to see on her face at all, since she first stepped through the school doors, something that looked almost like uncertainty, almost like a question she had not expected to be asking herself. "You are very young to speak with such confidence," she said. "I'm not confident," I said honestly. "I'm terrified. I just think being scared isn't a good enough reason to stay quiet when something wrong is about to happen to someone I care about." The Queen turned back to her daughter one final time, and the courtyard held its breath together, students and guards alike, waiting to see which way the moment would finally break. The man with the datapad still stood frozen near the Queen, the small metal disc resting in his open case, waiting for an instruction that had not yet come. I could see the tension in his hands, the uncertainty in the way his eyes darted between the Queen and Vex'lyra, unsure whether the ceremony he had prepared for weeks was about to happen or unravel entirely in front of an audience of human teenagers. The Queen closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, and when she opened them again, something had shifted in the set of her shoulders, something I could not fully name, but could feel from where I stood. "Put it away," she said quietly. The man blinked, clearly unsure he had heard correctly. Your Majesty? The disk, the Queen said, her voice steady now, carrying none of the earlier iron, but none of the earlier uncertainty either. Put it away, the rite will not proceed. A murmur rippled through the crowd of students behind me. Disbelief and relief tangled together, and I felt Vexlira's hand tighten around mine, so hard it almost hurt. I did not let go. The Queen stepped forward, crossing the courtyard slowly until she stood directly in front of her daughter's chair, close enough now that I could see the faint tremor in her own hands, hidden until this moment beneath the weight of formal authority. She knelt, something I imagined a queen rarely did for anyone, and looked directly into her daughter's eyes. I came here to finish something I was taught was necessary, she said quietly. Her voice meant only for the small circle of us gathered close, though it carried in the stillness of the courtyard regardless. I believed, truly, that I was protecting you from a lifetime of quiet exclusion, by making the exclusion formal and complete, sparing you the slow accumulation of small cruelties, by removing the possibility of hope entirely. I told myself this was mercy. It never felt like mercy, Vexlira said softly. No, the Queen said. I understand that now. I watched you here, on a world that owes our people nothing, choose to stand and be seen, rather than hide and be spared. I watched strangers choose to stand beside you without being asked, without anything to gain from it. That is not something our laws accounted for. That is not something I accounted for. She reached out and, in a gesture I recognized now from the small moments Vexlira had shared with me weeks earlier, pressed 2 fingers gently against her daughter's hand. You are not unfinished, the Queen said, and her voice, for the first time since she had arrived, sounded less like a ruler delivering judgment, and more like a mother, saying something she should have said, a very long time ago. I do not know yet how much of our law I am prepared to change. That will take time, and resistance, and more courage than I have needed in a very long while. But I will not begin that process by finishing what I came here to do. The courtyard let out a collective breath, and I felt my own knees nearly buckle with relief, the adrenaline that had carried me through the entire confrontation, finally draining out of me all at once. Noah put a hand on my shoulder to steady me, and I heard a few scattered claps from students still watching from the windows above, quickly hushed but unmistakably genuine. The Queen rose from her kneeling position and turned to address the small crowd of human students gathered by the school doors, her expression composed once more, though something in it had permanently softened. I owe your world an apology, she said, and her voice carried easily across the courtyard. I came here prepared to conduct a private matter with as little disturbance as possible. Instead, I have been shown something I did not expect to find, on a planet so new to the wider galaxy. A willingness to defend a stranger's dignity, without calculation, without expectation of reward. That is rarer among the stars than you might imagine. Nobody quite knew how to respond to that, myself included, so the silence stretched a moment longer before Mrs. Patel, of all people, stepped forward from the school doors, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone used to managing chaotic classrooms. On behalf of the school, she said carefully, we're glad to hear that. We'd be glad to help however we can, going forward, if there's anything you need. The Queen studied her for a moment, then inclined her head slightly, something that looked almost like genuine respect. There may be more value in continued study here than I initially believed, she said. I will need to consider how best to proceed. Over the following hour, the courtyard slowly returned to something resembling order. The guards stood down from their defensive formation, though they did not leave entirely. The man with the data pad, whose name I eventually learned was Aldrin Vess, moved through the crowd taking careful notes, occasionally pausing to ask a startled student a quiet question about their willingness to stand up for a classmate they barely knew. The principal, who had spent most of the morning locked in his office trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding on his campus, finally emerged to have a long, careful conversation with the Queen that I was not close enough to overhear, though I caught enough of it to understand that some kind of formal arrangement was being discussed, something about continued observation, continued exchange, a relationship between our world and the Athari Dominion that would look very different from this point forward. Vexlira stayed close to me through most of it, her chair parked beside mine near the edge of the courtyard, watching the strange unfolding aftermath with an expression I had never seen on her before. Something lighter, something unburdened. "You could have told me," I said eventually, once the worst of the chaos had settled and the two of us finally had a quiet moment together, "about who you really were. I wouldn't have treated you any differently." "I know that now," she said. "I did not know it then. I have spent my entire life being told that what I am is a liability, something to be managed quietly and kept from view. It did not occur to me that telling you the truth might change nothing at all." "It doesn't," I said. "You're still just Vex to me, Queen's daughter or not." She made that soft two-tone sound, the laugh I had grown to recognize as genuine, and for a moment, despite everything that had happened that morning, it felt almost like an ordinary day again. Word of what happened at our school spread quickly, first through the district, then through news channels eager for any story involving the alien visitors who had become part of daily life over the past 2 years, then further still, carried through diplomatic channels I would never fully understand, into corners of the galaxy I had never imagined existed. I was told, months later, by Aldrin Vess himself during one of his occasional visits back to Earth, that the phrase used in his report that day, "sustained voluntary care absent any apparent incentive," had become something of a quiet point of discussion among certain circles within the Athari court. Not everyone agreed with the Queen's decision. Change rarely comes without resistance, and I heard, secondhand, of arguments and disagreements playing out in places far above my understanding. But something had shifted, undeniably, in a way that could not be fully undone. Vex Lyra was formally restored to her place in the line of succession within a month, an announcement made quietly at first, then more widely, as the Athari court began, slowly and unevenly, to reconsider some of its oldest assumptions. She told me later that the changes would not happen quickly, that centuries of belief did not unravel because of one confrontation in one school courtyard on one distant world. But she also told me that for the first time in her life, she had stopped feeling like she needed to earn the right to simply exist as herself. And that alone, she said, felt like enough of a beginning. I did not receive any medals or formal recognition, not that I ever expected any. What I received instead was smaller and, in its own way, far more valuable. I kept walking Vex Lyra to class every morning, though her chair moved differently now, lighter somehow, even though nothing about its mechanics had changed. She sat with me and Noah at lunch, no longer at the far table near the recycling bins, and other Athari students, slowly, cautiously, began joining us too, testing the waters of a friendship they had once believed was forbidden to them. Craig Dunlop, to his credit, never bothered her again after that day. I do not know exactly what changed his mind, whether it was the sight of the Queen's guards standing in our hallway, or something quieter, that shifted in him, after watching an entire courtyard of classmates stand firm without hesitation. Either way, he kept his distance, and eventually, months later, I even saw him hold a door open for her without being asked, a small gesture that would have meant nothing on any other day, but meant something quite significant given where we had started. The ramp near the side entrance became something of a small, unofficial landmark at our school, though most students who used it every day had no idea of its history. Vex Lyra and I both knew, though, and sometimes, on quiet mornings, we would stop there together before heading inside, remembering the rainy day that started everything, though neither of us needed to say it out loud anymore. 6 months after the Queen's ships tore open the sky above our school, an official invitation arrived, delivered not through any human government channel but directly to our school, addressed with unusual formality to the students and staff who had, in the Queen's own words, demonstrated a form of courage the wider galaxy rarely encountered. It was an invitation to send a small delegation to observe a session of the Athari Dominion's ruling council, the first such invitation extended to representatives of Earth. I was asked, along with Vex Lyra and a handful of others, to be part of that delegation. I remember standing in the school parking lot the morning we were set to leave, looking up at a sky that no longer felt quite as vast and unknowable as it once had, and thinking about how strange it was that all of this, the ships, the Queen, the quiet reshaping of an ancient alien law, had started with something as small as a stuck hover chair and a crack in a hallway floor. Vex Lyra rolled up beside me, her chair humming softly in the morning quiet, and looked up at the same sky I had been studying. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "A little," I admitted. "You?" "Always," she said, "but I have learned that being frightened is not a reason to stay silent." I smiled, remembering where I had first heard those exact words, though I did not say it out loud. Some things did not need repeating to be understood. We boarded the transport together that morning, and as it rose slowly through the clouds, leaving the school, the hallway, and the small fixed ramp far below, I found myself thinking not about queens or fleets or ancient laws finally beginning to bend, but about a simple broken chair on an ordinary school morning, and a decision that had taken less than 5 seconds to make. It had been enough to change everything. It usually is.